The gunshots echoed through the modest house on South Gramercy Place at exactly 12:38 p.m. on April 1st, 1984. In the bedroom where Marvin Gaye had been arguing with his father just moments before, silence fell like a curtain dropping on the final act of a tragedy. The Prince of Soul lay dying on the floor, blood pooling beneath the man whose voice had once lifted millions of hearts, whose songs had soundtracked a generation's fight for love, peace, and understanding. At 44 years old, the man who had asked the world, "What's going on?" would never get to hear the answer. The paramedics who arrived at the scene found a house frozen in shock. Alberta Gaye, Marvin's mother, sat motionless in the living room, her world shattered by the impossible reality that her husband had just killed their son. Marvin Gaye Sr., the 70-year-old preacher who had tormented his boy for decades, stood in the hallway, the .38 revolver still in his hand, his face blank with the terrible finality of what he had done. "I shot him," he told the officers, his voice devoid of emotion. "He was going to kill me." But this wasn't how Marvin Gaye's story was supposed to end. This was the man who had given the world "What's Going On," "Sexual Healing," and "Let's Get It On," songs that had defined not just a genre but an entire era of American culture. This was the artist who had transformed Motown from a hit factory into a vehicle for social consciousness, who had used his golden voice to speak truth to power when the world needed to hear it most. The cruel irony was inescapable. The man who had sung so beautifully about love and peace had died in an act of violence at the hands of his own father. The voice that had pleaded for understanding had been silenced by the very person who should have protected it. The soul that had reached millions could never reach the one person who mattered most. The broken man who had destroyed his own son rather than try to understand him. Was this really a tragic accident? Or was it the inevitable conclusion of a lifetime of abuse, addiction, and unhealed wounds? What forces had conspired to bring one of music's greatest voices to this desperate end? The stage had been set for this tragedy from the very beginning, written in the scars of a father's belt and the silence of a mother who couldn't protect her child. But to understand how it all ended in that bedroom in Los Angeles, we must first understand how it all began. In the church pews of Washington, D.C., where a young boy learned that love and pain were often indistinguishable. Marvin Pence Gaye Jr. entered the world on April 2nd, 1939 in Washington, D.C., born into a household where God's love was preached but never practiced, where salvation was promised but never delivered. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was a minister in the house of God, a strict Pentecostal sect that demanded absolute obedience and offered punishment as the path to righteousness. His mother, Alberta, was a gentlewoman trapped in a marriage that had become her own form of imprisonment, watching helplessly as her husband's religious fervor turned their home into a place of fear and violence. The Gaye household was a study in contradictions that would shape Marvin's entire worldview. On Sundays, the family would dress in their finest clothes and march to church, where Marvin Sr. would preach about love, forgiveness, and the power of faith to transform lives. But the moment they returned home, that same man would become a tyrant, using his belt and his fists to beat submission into his children, particularly young Marvin, who showed an early independence that threatened his father's need for absolute control. Marvin Jr. learned his first crucial lesson in those early years. Love was something you performed, not something you felt. In church, he watched his father perform righteousness for the congregation, speaking of God's mercy while his own hands delivered only cruelty. At home, he watched his mother perform happiness, smiling and cooking and cleaning while bruises bloomed beneath her clothes like dark flowers. And slowly, inevitably, Marvin learned to perform too. To sing in the church choir with angelic beauty while his soul raged with questions that no one would answer. The church became both salvation and prison for young Marvin, His voice, even at age 8, possessed an otherworldly quality that made grown women weep and grown men fall silent. When he sang hymns like Precious Lord or How Great Thou Art, something transcendent happened. The pain and anger that lived inside him transformed into pure beauty, reaching heights that seemed to touch heaven itself. But the moment the music stopped, he was just another child in his father's house, another target for religious discipline that felt more like sadism than salvation. Could their early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs or tragedies? In the Gaye household, music became Marvin's first escape from a reality that felt unbearable. When his father's voice rose in anger, Marvin would retreat to the piano, losing himself in melodies that said everything his young heart couldn't express. When the belt came down across his back, he would sing hymns under his breath, using harmony to dull the sharp edges of physical pain. Music wasn't just his talent, it was his survival mechanism, his way of transforming suffering into something beautiful. By his teenage years, Marvin had developed the complex relationship with performance that would define his entire career. He learned that his voice could make people love him, could make them forget whatever else was wrong with him, could transform him from a preacher's problem child into something approaching divine. But he also learned that this love was conditional, dependent on his ability to deliver exactly what people expected from him, exactly when they expected it. The escape he found in music became even more necessary as his relationship with his father deteriorated. Marvin Sr. saw his son's musical gifts not as blessings but as threats to his authority, evidence that the boy was becoming too independent, too proud, too much like the world and not enough like the church. The beatings intensified, became more cruel and more frequent, as if the father was trying to literally beat the music out of his son. But Marvin had found something stronger than his father's fists, the power of his own voice to transport him somewhere else entirely. When he sang, he wasn't Marvin Gaye Jr., the preacher's son who never seemed good enough. He was something larger. Something that could reach into people's souls and move them in ways that sermons never could. Music became his rebellion, his declaration that he would not be crushed by the small, angry man who happened to be his father. At 17, unable to bear another day in his father's house, Marvin made the decision that would change his life forever. He dropped out of high school and enlisted in the Air Force, desperate for any escape from the toxic environment that had shaped his first 18 years. But the military proved no more welcoming than home had been. Marvin's sensitivity, his artistic nature, his very soul seemed incompatible with the rigid discipline and casual brutality of military life. The Air Force years were a disaster that taught Marvin another crucial lesson about survival. Sometimes you had to pretend to be someone else entirely to make it through. Unable to cope with military discipline, he began feigning mental illness, acting erratically enough to convince his superiors that he was unfit for service. It was a performance that saved him from what might have been years of misery, but it also reinforced the pattern that would plague him for the rest of his life. The belief that his authentic self was somehow wrong, something to be hidden or transformed. When he was discharged and returned to Washington, Marvin found a music scene that was beginning to buzz with new energy. The late 1950s were a time of transformation in American music, as gospel, blues, and jazz were cross-pollinating to create something entirely new: soul music. For a young man who had learned to channel pain into beauty, who had mastered the art of making people feel through song, this was the perfect moment to step onto the stage of history. He formed his first group, the Marquis, with friends who shared his passion for vocal harmony and his dreams of escape from ordinary life. They weren't just singing. They were creating a new sound that blended the sacred and the profane, church music and street music, the pain of experience with the hope of transcendence. When Marvin opened his mouth and let his voice soar, audiences didn't just hear music, They heard their own longings given voice, their own struggles transformed into something approaching prayer. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? The Marquise caught the attention of Harvey Fuqua, a veteran of the music industry who recognized in Marvin something special, not just a voice, but a presence that could carry an audience to places they didn't know they wanted to go. When Fuqua invited the group to join him as the new version of the Moonglows, Marvin knew he was being offered the chance he had dreamed of since childhood, the opportunity to make music his life, to transform his suffering into art that could reach millions. But success in music, Marvin was about to discover, came with its own forms of performance and its own types of pain. The stage that had seemed like freedom would reveal itself to be another kind of prison, one where his authentic self would have to compete with the image that audiences and record companies wanted to see. The boy who had learned to sing to survive would now have to learn to survive his own success. The phone call that changed everything came in 1960. Berry Gordy Jr., the ambitious young entrepreneur who had started Motown Records, had heard Marvin singing and wanted to offer him a contract. But there was a catch. Gordy didn't want the complex, searching artist that Marvin was becoming. He wanted a product, a commodity that could fit into the Motown machine and generate hits with clockwork regularity. The transformation from Marvin Gaye to Marvin Gaye, the added E, was his own touch, a small act of reinvention that felt like claiming ownership over his own identity, happened almost overnight. Suddenly, he was part of the most exciting musical revolution in America. Surrounded by talents like Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, and The Temptations, working in a studio where magic happened daily and hits were manufactured with scientific precision. But from the beginning, Marvin chafed against the Motown formula. While other artists seemed content to follow Berry Gordy's vision, singing whatever songs they were given and performing whatever personas were assigned to them, Marvin wanted something more. He wanted to pour his real experiences into his music, to sing about the pain and confusion that had shaped him, to create art that reflected the complexity of being Black in America during one of the most turbulent decades in the nation's history. His early hits, songs like Pride and Joy and How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, were undeniably catchy, undeniably successful, but they felt like costumes that didn't quite fit. Marvin was being asked to play the role of the happy-go-lucky lover, the man who had found all the answers to life's questions, when his real experience was of confusion, longing, and a deep spiritual searching that no 3-minute pop song could contain. Behind all that Motown glamour, was there an unbearable creative frustration that nobody saw? As the hits accumulated and the money poured in, Marvin found himself increasingly isolated from his own artistic impulses. The Motown system was designed to create stars, not artists, and the distinction was beginning to tear him apart. He wanted to sing about the war in Vietnam, about the struggle for civil rights, about the spiritual crisis that was consuming him. But those topics didn't fit the Motown brand of uplifting, danceable entertainment. The pressure to maintain his image as Motown's lover man led to increasingly elaborate performances both on and off stage. His marriage to Anna Gordy, Berry's sister, was as much about business as it was about love. A union that bound him even more tightly to the Motown family while providing him with none of the emotional support he desperately needed. Anna was 17 years older than Marvin, a sophisticated woman who understood the music business but couldn't understand the wounded boy inside the man she had married. Their relationship became another form of performance, another role that Marvin had to play while his authentic self remained hidden. He was expected to be the devoted husband, the grateful brother-in-law, the team player who would go along with whatever Berry Gordy decided was best for his career. But inside, he was still the preacher's son who had learned that love came with conditions, that success required the suppression of everything that made him unique and authentic. The breaking point came when he was paired with Tammi Terrell, a young singer whose voice blended with his in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Their duets, "Ain't No Mountain High Enough," "Your Precious Love," "Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing," were masterpieces of romantic chemistry, songs that convinced the world that they had found something magical together. But the reality was far more complex and ultimately far more tragic. Tammi was battling health problems that no one fully understood, suffering from severe headaches and dizzy spells that would eventually be diagnosed as brain tumors. Marvin watched helplessly as the woman who had become his closest musical collaborator and dearest friend began to deteriorate before his eyes. During performances, she would sometimes collapse on stage, leaving Marvin to carry on alone, his voice breaking with the weight of watching someone he loved slowly die. When Tammi finally succumbed to her illness in 1970, something fundamental broke inside Marvin. He had lost not just a musical partner, but a person who had understood his artistic vision, who had shared his desire to create music that touched people's souls rather than just their feet. Her death forced him to confront the meaninglessness of the commercial music he had been making, the emptiness of a career built on other people's expectations rather than his own truth. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? Tammi's death coincided with a period of unprecedented turmoil in American society. The Vietnam War was raging, civil rights leaders were being assassinated, and young people were taking to the streets to demand answers to questions that no one seemed able to address. Marvin, like millions of others, found himself asking the question that would become his greatest song. What's going on? The answer came in the form of the most important album of his career. What's Going On, released in 1971, was Marvin's declaration of independence from the Motown formula, his insistence that popular music could address serious subjects, that entertainment and enlightenment didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Songs like Inner City Blues and Mercy, Mercy Me tackled poverty, environmental destruction, and the spiritual emptiness of modern life with a directness that no Motown artist had attempted before. But creating the album required Marvin to fight battles on every front. Berry Gordy initially refused to release the title track, calling it "the worst record I ever heard," and insisting that it would destroy Marvin's career. When the song became a massive hit anyway, proving that audiences were hungry for music with meaning, Gordy relented and allowed Marvin to complete the album on his own terms. The success of What's Going On transformed Marvin from a pop star into an artist, from a performer into a voice for his generation. But it also isolated him further from the Motown family, marking him as a troublemaker, someone who couldn't be counted on to follow orders and generate predictable hits. The very success that should have liberated him instead created new pressures, new expectations that he would continue to be a spokesman for social consciousness, when what he really wanted was the freedom to explore whatever interested him musically. The 1970s became a period of intense creativity and personal chaos for Marvin. Albums like Let's Get It On and I Want You showcased his evolution as both artist and man, exploring themes of sexuality and spirituality with a frankness that shocked some fans and thrilled others. But success couldn't heal the wounds that had been inflicted during his childhood, couldn't fill the void that his father's abuse had carved in his soul. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? As Marvin's artistic reputation soared, his personal life began to crumble. His marriage to Anna deteriorated beyond repair, destroyed by his infidelities, her jealousy, and their mutual inability to give each other what they needed emotionally. His relationship with Berry Gordy became increasingly strained as Marvin insisted on creative control that threatened the carefully maintained Motown system. Most damaging of all was his growing dependence on cocaine, a drug that seemed to offer everything he had been searching for: confidence, energy, and temporary relief from the psychological pain that had plagued him since childhood. But cocaine was a seductive liar, promising escape while actually deepening his isolation, promising clarity while clouding his judgment, promising relief while creating new forms of suffering. The drug use began as a creative tool, a way to stay up all night in the studio to tap into emotions and insights that seemed just beyond his normal reach. But gradually it became a necessity, the only way he could function in a world that felt increasingly hostile and demanding. Interviews from this period show a man who was simultaneously at the peak of his artistic powers and the depths of his personal despair, creating beautiful music while slowly destroying the person who was creating it. His second marriage to Janice Hunter provided temporary hope that he could find the love and stability that had eluded him throughout his life. Janice was young, beautiful, and initially seemed to understand and accept the complex, troubled man she was marrying. Their relationship produced 2 children, Nona and Frankie, who became the lights of Marvin's life, the people for whom he most wanted to be a better man than his father had been. But the patterns established in childhood proved stronger than good intentions. Marvin found himself repeating many of his father's mistakes, becoming emotionally distant from his children, unable to express love except through material gifts, struggling with the same rage and disappointment that had consumed Marvin Sr. The cycle of damage was perpetuating itself, despite his desperate desire to break free from it. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? By the early 1980s, Marvin was facing financial ruin due to his cocaine addiction, legal troubles stemming from his divorce from Anna, and IRS problems that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build. The man who had once been worth millions was now living in exile in Europe, unable to return to America without facing arrest, unable to perform without risking complete collapse. His final album, Sexual Healing, represented one last attempt at redemption, both personal and professional. The title track became his biggest hit in years, proving that his voice could still move people, that his artistry remained intact even as his life fell apart. But the success came too late to save him from the demons that had been pursuing him since childhood. The decision to return to America and move in with his parents was born of desperation rather than hope. At 44 years old, Marvin was broke, addicted, and emotionally broken, a man who had achieved everything he had dreamed of as a child, only to discover that success couldn't heal the wounds inflicted by his father's abuse. Moving back to the house where his trauma began felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that he would never be able to escape the patterns that had been established in those early years. But perhaps most tragic of all was the fact that Marvin Sr., now in his 70s, hadn't changed at all. The same need for control, the same explosive anger, the same inability to show love or understanding that had defined his relationship with his son decades earlier remained intact. The old man saw his son's return not as an opportunity for reconciliation, but as a threat to his authority in his own home. The house on South Gramercy Place became a powder keg, with 2 damaged men circling each other like wounded animals, each carrying decades of unhealed wounds, each incapable of giving the other what they needed. Marvin Jr. wanted acknowledgement of the pain his father had caused, some sign that the abuse he had suffered as a child had been wrong. Marvin Sr. wanted submission and gratitude, the same absolute obedience he had always demanded. The morning of April 1st, 1984, began like many others had in recent months, with tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Marvin Jr. was high on cocaine, paranoid and agitated, convinced that people were plotting against him. Marvin Sr. was frustrated by his son's behavior, his drug use, his refusal to show proper respect. Alberta Gaye sat caught between them as she had been for nearly 45 years, watching helplessly as the two men she loved most destroyed each other. The argument that led to the shooting was, according to witnesses, about something trivial, insurance papers or maybe money, the kind of domestic disagreement that happens in families every day. But this was no ordinary family. This was a father and son who had been locked in a battle for dominance and understanding since the day Marvin Jr. was born, each carrying wounds that had never healed, each incapable of backing down. When Marvin Jr. shoved his father during the argument, he crossed a line that the old man couldn't tolerate. Marvin Sr. went to his bedroom, retrieved the .38 revolver he kept for protection, and returned to end the conflict once and for all. The first shot hit Marvin in his chest. As he fell, his father fired again, the second bullet finding its mark with deadly precision. The paramedics who arrived at the scene found Marvin Gaye lying on the floor of his childhood bedroom, his life bleeding away as his mother knelt beside him, praying to the same God who had presided over decades of family dysfunction. He was conscious for a few moments, his eyes finding hers, perhaps trying to say something that had never been said. Perhaps finally understanding that some wounds can never heal. At Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, doctors pronounced Marvin Gaye dead at 1:01 p.m. on April 1st, 1984, one day before his 45th birthday. The man who had given voice to a generation's hopes and fears, who had transformed popular music and challenged America to confront its own contradictions, was gone. Killed not by the streets, not by the industry, not by his own excesses, but by the first person who had ever hurt him. The man who should have been his protector and had instead become his destroyer. The news of Marvin's death sent shockwaves through the music world and beyond. Fans gathered outside Motown's offices, playing his songs and trying to make sense of a loss that felt both shocking and somehow inevitable. How could the man who had sung so beautifully about love have died so violently? How could the voice that had preached understanding have been silenced by the ultimate failure of understanding? The trial of Marvin Gaye Sr. was a brief, sad affair. The old man pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, claiming he had acted in self-defense when his son attacked him. He was sentenced to just 6 years of probation, the judge apparently accepting the argument that he was an elderly man who had been defending himself against his drug-addled son. No jail time for ending the life of one of America's greatest artists. No acknowledgement that this tragedy had been building for 45 years. But the verdict missed the larger truth about what had happened in that bedroom. This wasn't really about self-defense or even about domestic violence in the conventional sense. This was about the culmination of decades of unhealed trauma, of a cycle of abuse that had been passed down from generation to generation, of two men who had never learned how to love each other despite sharing the same blood and the same pain. Was their death as straightforward as reported? Or were powerful hidden forces involved? The questions surrounding Marvin Gaye's murder speak to something deeper than family dysfunction or domestic violence. His story represents the ultimate tragedy of American success, a man who had transcended his circumstances to become beloved by millions, only to be destroyed by the very person who had damaged him from the beginning. In death, Marvin Gaye became more than just a musician who had died too young. He became a symbol of the price of unhealed trauma, of what happens when success and fame can't heal the wounds inflicted in childhood. His music, which had always been deeply personal, took on new meaning as audiences understood that every song had been a cry for help, every performance an attempt to transform pain into beauty. The legacy he left behind was complex and contradictory, like the man himself. His influence on popular music was undeniable. Artists from Stevie Wonder to D'Angelo continued to cite him as an inspiration, and songs like "What's Going On" remained as relevant to new generations as they had been to his own. But his personal legacy was more complicated, a reminder that artistic genius and personal happiness don't necessarily go hand in hand. Perhaps most importantly, Marvin Gaye's story forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about masculinity, family violence, and the ways that childhood trauma can echo through generations. His death sparked conversations about domestic abuse, about the particular ways that trauma affects Black families, about the responsibility of the music industry to protect its artists from their own demons. In the years since his death, Marvin Gaye has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, received countless posthumous honors, and seen his music sampled and covered by artists across every genre. What's Going On was named one of the greatest albums of all time, and songs like Sexual Healing continued to find new audiences decades after their release. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Marvin Gaye's memory is the fact that his questions remain relevant. What's going on is still being asked by new generations facing their own forms of social upheaval, their own struggles for understanding and justice. His music continues to provide comfort to people dealing with their own pain, their own searches for meaning in a world that often seems indifferent to individual suffering. The boy who had learned to sing to survive in his father's house had grown into a man whose songs helped millions of others survive their own struggles. The voice that had been silenced by violence lived on in the grooves of records and the memories of those who had been touched by his artistry. The soul that had been damaged by abuse had created music that healed others even if it couldn't heal himself. Marvin Gaye made music to reach people, but in the end, he reached more souls than he ever could have imagined. Not in spite of his pain, but because of it. His tragedy became his triumph. His wounds became his gift to the world. His questions became the soundtrack to America's ongoing struggle to understand itself. He had spent his entire life trying to escape the house where he had first learned that love could hurt. But on April 1st, 1984, there was no song powerful enough to transform the violence back into music, no melody beautiful enough to make his father remember that the boy he was killing had once sung hymns with the voice of an angel. The man who had asked what was going on never got to hear the answer, but his voice continues to ask the question. And in that asking, there remains hope that someday, someone might finally know.